This will be an unusual video, to complement our unusual times. I figured because there's so much strangeness in the air, and because I've built up so much to say over the past year or two, and can't possibly devote full-length videos to each major topic, and because most of us are stuck indoors in a quarantine situation, why not just take a casual, eclectic walk through a slew of subject matter, with the backdrop of some hopefully pleasant music and visuals. I tend to spend most of my day thinking deeply on the better and more serene days, and I've long been in the habit, which I highly recommend, of noting down the exceptional high points of this thinking process. This video will aim to be a distillation of many of these notes, just to get the ideas out there. I probably won't do this again, but we'll see how it goes. Firstly, with regard to the major topic on everyone's mind, this won't be a video about the virus for the most part. There's no doubt this is a pivotal moment in history, and no doubt deeply significant things are happening, seemingly related to, yet above and beyond, the virus itself. I think the coming weeks, days even, will tell the tale, and shed quite a bit more light on what exactly is going on. In the meantime, I hope everyone is sensibly prepared, as we always should be, staying sane, calm, and maintaining some perspective. No matter how hairy things might get, this too shall pass, and that inherited blood flowing through your veins has been witness to much worse in the past. A few takeaways from this situation. It's in jarring and jolting times like these, especially if it gets a great deal worse, that perspectives and outlooks can change virtually overnight, especially for those who've lived in relatively comfortable and perhaps unthinking stupor. The world will change accordingly. One of the realizations I hope most people draw from this is that our nations have developed and evolved in irresponsible and disordered ways. There's a class of men that profit greatly from making nations dependent on each other via a deeply corrupt international trade structure, destroying their robust independence and sovereignty and replacing it with a house of cards in delicate balance, prone to collapse in so much as a strong breeze, let alone hurricanes or tornadoes. They're the same men that fight for the destruction of native cultures and peoples through open borders and mass refugee programs. And I've truly come to believe many of these care nothing for the consequences of their actions. The first things any healthy nation should seek to do, aside from crafting a political or economic structure to keep such parasites far away from any important rules, is to ensure it can grow its own food, create its own energy, maintain its own defense, and manufacture its own absolute necessities, like medications. Everything else is secondary, and most Western nations today have dropped the ball on nearly all of these fronts. And normally, in a situation like the one we're facing, we'd feel relatively invincible, especially in a nation like America. In a 1930s or 40s or 50s America, the innate pioneering spirit and attitude of hopeful optimism, coupled with a strong sense of pride, national identity, and social cohesion, made it seem like anything was possible. And it likely was. When good people are collaboratively firing on all cylinders towards common goals, nothing is out of reach. Hints and traces of this mindset still exist today, certainly, but we're also a deeply divided nation, with very different visions of the past, present, and future. And after decades of media indoctrination, there's much palpable hate in the air. The descendants of those that envisioned and created this great nation are now roundly despised, and taught to despise themselves, by this new culture that so quickly slithered into power. And when the average man on the street doesn't feel that bond with their fellow citizen, this affects everything. A fact that'll become much more readily obvious if things truly degenerate. And this is my last point on our immediate situation before I move on. It's so easy to take this type of civilizational order and efficiency for granted. These ideas and institutions and higher societal standards, crafted by that type of great man in such short supply today, that have allowed us to operate without open warfare in our streets. But it really is a fragile, delicate balance. And worst case scenario here, we're all about to find this out the hard way. It's already beginning. Reports of speed limits being wholly ignored, fights breaking out all over the nation over toilet paper and similar nonsense, footage of people walking into stores and calmly filling backpacks full of stolen goods before walking out. Many of the more liberal areas have now stated openly they won't prosecute such crimes. If word gets around, considering our demographic situation, things might get very ugly very quickly. History shows us clearly that such an unraveling tends to happen exponentially. And this makes perfect sense, because when order breaks down in one context, it becomes far easier for it to break down in others. And just as importantly, to envision it breaking down in others. And soon, the hive mind is operating on the frequency of the jungle, as full-scale panic takes hold. Order is, after all, something that begins in our minds. It's a psychological conception that causes us to respect that courthouse, or that security guard, or that officer. If the moment comes that this fear and respect is no longer felt, we'll immediately begin to pay the price for our decades of mistakes. And before we leave this topic, a quick note on how we got to this point. Let's pull back significantly and consider the manner of life several hundred years ago. At almost any point in the Western world, individuals had no problem fulfilling essential needs like food or shelter, even games and entertainments. Many even found themselves with a great deal of free time. Flash forward to the present day with our massive advances in technology, reducing the time and effort required to yield food, clothing, shelter, or consumer products, and one would think we'd have nothing but free time, and essentially be living in a paradise of sorts. This obviously isn't the case. So why isn't it the case? When a nation passes subsistence level, it faces an unspoken choice of where to channel its excess energies. Some civilizations of prior eras chose art and beauty as their leading aims. Others, major construction projects and architectural wonders. Others devoted themselves to the realm of thought, or becoming feared and respected military powers. We, in the post-World War II world, especially in America, chose something akin to the game of Monopoly. It might be better to say we were guided into choosing the game of Monopoly, as it so efficiently channels our energies in the direction of a small group that created and maintained the game. Increasingly, I found this to be a helpful analogy. It's as if we pulled a board game off the shelf and allowed ourselves to become so fixated as to forget what it means to live. It's sick. One of the greatest crimes in history and a monumental waste of human potential and creativity. And worse than a waste, because these energies aren't just frittered away in meaningless directions, but ultimately directed towards the very destruction of the best and brightest, and specifically the destruction of an entire people and their culture. In fact, this seems to be an actual metric that determines upward mobility in the worlds of academia, entertainment, or finance, among others. Meaning, the more eager one is to destroy Western civilization and heritage, or even Western people themselves, the more they're embraced by our money-driven structure and its leading players. And it makes sense as to why this works, and has worked historically. Why quislings might always be found to act as errand boys for the hand that feeds them. Picture someone offering you a great deal of money to betray your entire family. As they do so, imagine them reminding you of your family's every fault, perhaps exaggerating them, even making several up out of whole cloth. So now you're provided with both a major incentive and an excuse, some feeling of justification. Our system is now geared towards finding these people, grooming them, and thereby creating a little army of largely unthinking, profit-seeking individuals on autopilot. trained not to ask questions, who then circle the wagons and protect one another if challenged in any way. As time goes on, many of those willing to thrust a dagger into the back of their nation aren't even of the same racial or cultural background, and in some cases, are first or second generation migrants, who've had no skin in the game with regard to the creation and development of the nation. And this, too, makes sense. After all, why would we ever think that people who are not the biological heirs of Western civilization would choose to carry it forward as we have? There's no group more dangerously and destructively ignorant than the New York Times or Washington Post reading white, or fellow white, leftist in the US. And one of the most obvious truths they've seemed completely unwilling to grasp, a failure that has caused immense amounts of suffering and death, all told, is this. There is no magical transformation the moment a refugee or migrant steps across the border. Instead, the man from Haiti brings Haiti with him. The man from Somalia brings Somalia with him. Insofar as these nations have lower standards across the board, this means each and every one of their citizens we usher into our borders incrementally moves our nations in these directions. And in fact, because we've been taught to so despise our own culture and jettison it in favor of others, or in favor of some vague world culture international money forces so push the conception of, this incremental shift happens even more rapidly. And this destructively ignorant group would hear the words I've just used here and believe me to be a racist accordingly. But here's the thing about that. I genuinely feel for any good person in desperate need, and would want to see them meaningfully helped, with emphasis on meaningfully. But this doesn't mean inviting them to live next door. And most importantly, and this is such a crucial point, we can't be of any help to the world if we can't keep our own house in order. There's a reason the Western world has had such an exceptional history of accomplishing anything it sets its mind to. It's because we've managed to maintain such a high level of discipline and order, high standards, and a high culture. This becomes impossible when we import millions from nations that lack these things. Every nation receiving this massive influx of foreign humanity begins being slowed to the level of the lowest common denominator over time. We no longer have towering aspirational peaks along with our valleys, but instead the world is being forcibly remade into a flat, unremarkable horizon, and eventually the entire world would suffer for it. Looking on at this swift decline can be infuriating and depressing, but we need to be careful here. If the rapid cultural shift and demographic replacement and the universal lowering of standards represents one disease we're battling, the other might be depression and nihilism. There are countless reasons to be optimistic at the moment, and I'd contend those who can't sense the very real shift taking place over the past few years aren't paying close attention. At this late hour, with civilization itself on the ropes and threatened from forces both inside and out, more people than ever before are finding the courage to stand up and speak their mind in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. The amount of disdain felt for media and celebrity and popular culture figures is immense, and the subsets still lining up to digest their programming, emphasis on that word programming, via cable or Netflix or Amazon, seems to be getting smaller by the day. But I don't want to speak to all the positive signs of change so much as to speak to the broader danger of the poison of a bleak or hopeless mindset. To use an example, I'd like to speak about Jordan Peterson, and regardless of my points of disagreement or any suspicions I might have regarding his overall intent, I genuinely wish him the best on a personal level, as he seems to be in a very dark place. Yet, to be frank, this is one of the first red flags that gave me pause in listening to the man. I've heard him say several times, almost flippantly and without caveats or qualifications, the sentence, "Life is suffering." He even claims this was a core tenet of Buddhist teachings, which I think is a common mistake and something I believe to be a significant misread, especially in totality of context. This outlook on life is pure poison, and if truly embraced and internalized, makes a psychological breakdown and a lifetime of darkness all but inevitable. If you're looking for darkness, you will always find it. If you're looking for reasons to suffer, you will always find them. There is darkness and light in the world. We get to choose which of these we place a greater focus on. And I couldn't possibly stress enough the importance of this decision. The best part of the heroic tradition in the West is centered around tales of men who, though they might be surrounded by darkness and facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles, kept their eyes fixed on a light in the distance. This light was life, not the darkness, and in a sense they strove to embrace this light, become it, and serve to spread it. It's weakness and misunderstanding that causes one to do otherwise, and wallow in self-pity and despair, pretending all is doom and gloom. It's a purposeful averting of the eyes away from this light, pretending it doesn't exist, or that it's an illusion, and only the blackness actually exists. I feel for Jordan Peterson, yet also feel the need to speak out against this darkness he spreads, in adherence to core beliefs like this one. I don't agree with those that call him the stupid man smart man, or call him unintelligent. I think he does have a quick and capable mind, and I personally think he's correct on a great many points. But I'm certain he's incorrect here. And a wrong turn at this fundamental level leads to so many other wrong turns down the road. I'm convinced he's agnostic at least, if not outright atheist, and he seems to present God as little more than some sort of utilitarian solution, something of a self-help path. And I can't help but find this revolting. Instead of recognizing the divine as so high and lofty as to evade complete understanding, let alone description, he seems to cheapen it to the level of an idea invented just to provide ourselves a bit of comfort and instruction. Many years ago, this might have made sense to my ear on some level. I like to think my thinking has evolved quite a bit since, and I feel I recognize just how backward this is. Of course, I don't know the man personally, so all that I say here should be taken with a grain of salt. But I've gathered that he seems enamored with academic and intellectual culture, and by association, also Jewish culture and ethos, specifically. He has nothing but the highest praise for the general philosophy and worldview arising from this camp. And consider what happened to psychology, in particular, after the Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung split, and after the Western world sided with Freud and a very Jewish psychology post-World War II. The focus of this psychology is on the darkness. They so often teach us to find the darkest moment in our past, usually some childhood drama, and make this a central pillar in our lives, which we might then orient everything else around. Or one could even say blame everything else upon. It's difficult to think of a more destructive conception. It'd be like defining your race and culture around a single historical tragedy, which is pure madness. And this is a topic worthy of a video on its own. But to avoid digressing too much here, let's just say that this seems to be a foremost break between two outlooks of two very different people groups. On one extreme, you have the life-affirming Christ being pure light and love, and heaven as bliss, or the concept of the beautiful and bright Balder in the Norse tradition, and Valhalla, a frame in which this life is essentially a stage for great adventure and displays of nobility and courage, and those who die valiantly in the service of something higher find themselves transported to a similar bliss. And this is almost precisely the same theme of Arjuna on the battlefield in the Bhagavad Gita. And remember, the Buddha was famous for his enigmatic smile. We're not a people that traditionally focuses on and orients our lives around the darkness. Despite having lived through the greatest possible upheavals time and time again, even still, our gaze remains fixed upward. In fact, I've come to believe strongly that should this ever change, all is lost. This is a level of spiritual and cultural subversion we simply can't allow. Ever. Life is not suffering, Jordan Peterson. Life contains an element of suffering, and obstacles and trials and hardships, and if it didn't, proving oneself would be impossible. Endurance and heroism and greatness would cease to exist as conceptions. So much depends on the frame through which we see life itself. For example, we've come to view warfare and death on the battlefield as the greatest and most senseless tragedy, and this makes sense in our age. Wars are now often fought for deeply ignoble reasons, and ultimately at the behest of a banker class that treats peoples and nations as pieces on a chessboard and seeks personal gain around every corner, by any means necessary. The world wars were the definition of wasteful slaughter. And yet, things weren't always this way. For example, in ancient Germanic societies of the highest caliber, I don't think things degenerated into warfare, as is our modern viewpoint. I think they often ascended into warfare in the Aryan tradition. A bit like a buck in rutting season, seeking great risk to prove himself, this warfare was a natural state of being, arising from tremendous health and an excess of vital energy. Men knew the great risks, yet took them willingly. This mutual testing of mettle helped men come to know themselves and one another far better, helped develop efficient and effective hierarchies, and allowed stronger or healthier or better-oriented peoples to preserve influence or leadership over those that were perhaps more chaotic or undisciplined. Ideally, and often, for the greater good. And with regard to the most significant battles in recorded history, such as the Goths and Romans joining forces to prevent the incursion of the Huns, or Charles Martel standing against the Islamic push into Europe, there's something transcendently beautiful here in heroically being willing to go to any lengths to defend family and culture and nation and preserve their sacred freedoms and way of life. And let's be frank, many of our most heroic and courageous fell on these fields, with much of our best blood being absorbed into this soil. But ultimately, the choice is ours as to whether this blood fertilizes the ground for the growth of something great. Ironically, it was only when scheming court eunuchs and their handlers began to take power, men who'd never seen a battlefield in their lifetimes, that warfare became less healthy and natural, and a more utilitarian power grab to benefit the very worst sorts of men, who began so expertly operating behind the scenes. A nihilistic mindset and a dark and negative outlook doesn't just tear you to pieces internally, it also makes a person innately unlikable. To be liked or loved, you need to like and love things. Good people tend to naturally be drawn to what they intuitively sense are healthy and life-affirming conceptions. Hundreds of thousands so resonated with Jordan Peterson when he struck a chord that helped give them hope, that told them to take responsibility for themselves and their state of being, that provided a path away from much of their chaos and confusion, and set portions of the world in good order. This was his draw, and justifiably so. Much of the best of what he brought to the table was a rehash of great wisdom of the past. We simply needed reminders, and always will need reminders. But the ultimate tragic irony here is that a man who was helping so many others take the first steps towards finding real meaning in their lives seemingly wasn't able to find deep meaning in his own, in my blunt opinion. And this couldn't help but emerge over time. Again, I certainly don't mean to kick a man while he's down, especially a potentially well-intentioned one. But I think one of the lessons here is to learn to take the best of what a thinker or personality might offer you, ride that train as long as it maintains forward momentum, but be ready to hop off a bit wiser and richer as soon as it seems to stall. And if our goal in thinking and communicating is to help make greater sense of the world and restore order to this chaos, that's exactly how it should be. It'd be selfish and wrong-headed to want it any other way. And I'd like to repeat something just voiced for emphasis. To be liked or loved, you have to learn to like and love. You have to find things to like and love about the world. To be a positive force that people might resonate with, you need to find a positive path. The path of negation is exhausting chaos, and this is especially important for all of us to hear, as we watch much of what we love crumble around us. If we immerse ourselves in this darkness and see only the bad happening around us, we inevitably push people away, both as individuals and as a group. The artful balance is in learning to see the light and positive possibilities and potentialities, and making this the foremost focus to strive towards. Fighting against is never enough. We need to fight for. I just stumbled across this in my notes, though I don't know where the text is from. Quote, "All pain is a teacher. All blessings, just that. Believe this at your core, and you will never be unhappy in a struggle." End quote. And another snippet from my notes, from who knows where. Quote, "Let them have cronyism, nepotism, endless promotion, even complete temporary and material success. Let us focus on mastery, excellence, on wisdom, on physical, intellectual, and spiritual maturity, and health. When the rift between these two grows too large, not a man in the world will fail to recognize the game being played." End quote. While we've been training at high altitude, in low oxygen, on a playing field so steeply and artificially tilted against us, they've been coddled at sea level, growing weak from lifetimes of seeking instant gratification, pleasure, and contentment. And this leads to another important point, one of the most valuable I feel I've gleaned either directly or indirectly from nearly every major ancient spiritual teaching in the Western tradition. If you'd like to be happy, don't seek happiness. Happiness is a byproduct of other, far more meaningful pursuits. Seek to find your own destined path in life and walk it to the best of your ability, and happiness can't help but tag along. Seek health, order, beauty, excellence, and some higher calling. In short, strive for anything more deeply meaningful, and happiness is the byproduct of the process. This certainly doesn't mean a lack of ups and downs, but it does all but guarantee a slowly but surely ascending line, despite any jarring missteps along the way. The cult of happiness emerging in recent decades is one of the most disappointing aspects of modernity. We seek the celebration, forgetting that celebrations are only meaningful when they come as a result of some achievement, some accomplishment or obstacle overcome. A life of constant unearned celebration makes the process completely hollow, like a drug addiction, in which one has to keep upping the dose to receive the same pleasurable feeling, until finally, constant doses become mandatory to so much as keep an even keel, and keep from becoming despondent. Happiness can't be an end goal, and in fact, such a mindset is completely unworthy of a man. Far better to let it arrive on its own time, as side effect and justified reward. Equally unnatural is that urge to permanently banish sadness, or to expect such a thing might be possible in the material plane. Virtually every great wisdom tradition echoes the concept that for everything there is a season. It'd be impossible to have a springtime and a summer if it weren't for fall and winter. Summer is summer in contrast to winter. Becoming comfortable with all seasons and recognizing their necessity seems to mark a significant leap forward with regard to cultivating wisdom or balance in life. Endure your winters. Attempt to prepare and be ready for them insofar as possible. The sun will always come out again. And in fact, the longer and more terrible and bleak the winter, the more deeply gratifying and uplifting the eventual summer. The writer Charles Murray, co-author of the now famous Bell Curve and similar intriguing works, mentions 4 cores he believes are needed for happiness, namely family, community, vocation, and faith. And I think this is close to the mark. In my own strange case, speaking personally, I feel almost as if I've blended all 4 together and can't easily see dividing lines anymore. And despite quite a few hardships, happiness does seem a reliable companion on the whole as a result. And speaking of Charles Murray, I wanted to make an interesting point as to why I think there are so few of his types. Roger Scruton once said, "It is not so unusual to be a conservative, but it is unusual to be an intellectual conservative." And of course, this is true. But I don't think many have considered why it's true. There doesn't seem to be an intelligence gap between right and left, and in fact, many studies I've seen seem to indicate that if there is, it's the right which has the IQ edge, though much of this might be explained by issues of racial demographics. But with regard to intellectuals, the left certainly has a near monopoly here. And I think the reason is as simple as it is fascinating. Increasingly, intellectualism is defined more and more as those who embrace and promulgate complexity and complex ideas, as opposed to exercising true problem-solving ability or keen and proven judgment. Complexity and newness represents a moving away from a core that true conservatives of the ancient type seek to conserve. In other words, intellectualism is leftism in a sense. Johann Goethe said it well in voicing his personal opinions of the Jewish culture and character. Quote, "This crafty race has one great principle. As long as order prevails, there is nothing to be gained." End quote. And this might be properly said of the most proactive, self-described intellectuals. Spearheading a shock to the system or natural order with a new idea or institution is a great way to gain attention, power, influence, and certainly money. Unfortunately, most new ideas are quite bad, even if they might appear otherwise at first glance due to hype and manipulative framing. And the same might be said of most new institutions, even technologies. This certainly isn't to say that innovation is always a net negative, but it is to say that if not done with the greatest possible care, by well-oriented and healthy minds striving towards positive goals, the result will almost certainly be a net negative for all except the small handful positioned to personally gain. Intellectualism is almost exactly this, as manifested in the realm of ideas, and they become the leaders of a full-scale onslaught on the more ancient and time-tested modes of thinking and being. To quote Roger Scruton once more, "The convention is now to be hostile to convention." And this holds especially true if one considers the latter use of convention here to mean the most foundational aspects of our culture. It's nothing short of incredible how efficiently our, quote, institutions of higher learning were turned into training grounds for deconstructionist revolutionaries. And it's everything we prize most highly that they seek to deconstruct. Which, of course, is just a slightly tamer way of saying destroy. Intellectualism has become something of a dirty word in our circles, and I believe this to be completely justified. But I'd like to make sure this isn't confused with an attack on all academics, but rather the unhealthy trends of modern academia. Not an attack on the importance of intellect or knowledge, but an attack on what increasingly masquerades as intellect or knowledge. The convoluted and tangled webs self-professed intellectuals have weaved over recent decades have been the furthest thing from a genuine and well-meaning search for truth, and they've marked a backsliding on the human journey. This type of man has been, and always will be, enamored with the products of their own fallible subjective reasoning, leading to hasty and impetuous missteps. And as they pat themselves on the back for their works of genius, their philosophies and doctrines and frameworks often represent a spiraling out into chaos, polluted thinking, and polluted language. and I think this segues appropriately into the next topic. I'm not usually a fan of those types of buzzwords and technical phrases so often used to make individuals or their ideas seem a bit more intelligent or refined than they really are. But I recently came across the term epistemic polarity, and it immediately struck me as the most appropriate and helpful label to a phenomenon we're witnessing at the moment to a degree I've not seen before. Namely, the factional split throughout the Western world, but especially in the US, that seems both deep and all-encompassing, and going far beyond the mere political. One group has a deeply rooted faith and trust in experts of all stripes, in academia, in our media, and even influential celebrity figures. They embrace this world, and they seem to believe it to be reliable. And the other group has cultivated a deeply rooted mistrust in these same elements, believing them to be not merely wrong in many cases, but often proactively dishonest or misleading or manipulative. I hope everyone recognizes the significance of this and the ramifications. These are two divergent realities being created, two different worlds in a very real sense, and the chance of their coexisting peacefully is essentially zero. There are great dangers down this path, of course, especially for peace and security and the long-term viability of our nations as we know them today. But there are equally great possibilities here and great potential. Those in this latter group, which seems to be growing quickly, recognize something is very wrong, and that there seems to be a well-orchestrated and choreographed dishonesty at nearly every meaningful level. But many of these don't yet recognize the nature of these lies, or the liars themselves. They only need more information and greater context to fill in the missing pieces. I hope we all recognize what a pivotal moment this is, and how little efforts might go a long way, especially in their ripple effects over time. Reading back over my notes just now, I was especially struck by a line I must have added quite a while ago. Quote, "There seems to be more evidence that those in power wish to harm or restrain us than to meaningfully help us. Think about all this means. We need to face this possibility." End quote. I stand by this, and assuming this has become generally true, it means this faction of humanity, so efficiently herded by media and academia, aren't simply a willing army for a group of mistake-prone incompetents, but rather an army actively serving a group of willful destroyers. Even if the majority of this army is composed of mere social climbers, operating largely on autopilot, they're still capable of incredible damage if left unchecked. Thankfully, they seem to be increasingly checked more and more often, and I hope we might play our part to ensure this trend continues and accelerates. I suppose I'll wrap this up before it gets too long, but not before addressing the Phoenix Project. The announcement went well, and I've been happy with the significant interest, and especially happy with the caliber of individuals recently brought in. We now have several projects up and running, and we still seek project managers and leaders for several other great ideas. So if you're interested in participating in any way, including simply joining discussions and making some new friends and contacts, the door is still open. Email TPPAdmissions@protonmail.com to kickstart the invitation process. We've tried to place an emphasis on quality over quantity, so we do have a bit of a screening process on the way in, but we've still had several hundred people arrive over the past 2 weeks, and frankly, the structure we've collaboratively built and continue to build can handle more. So I'd encourage those already involved to reach out to anyone they feel might be a worthy addition. Also, it's important to reiterate what the Phoenix Project is and isn't. It's not my construct or creation, and will be still less so as I start to focus more of my attention on upcoming video creations. It's still probably the best place to reach me, and I'll certainly continue to be active there. But it's important to emphasize the point that this is something we're all building. Yes, we did try to have some basics in place, like a loose-knit structure and some moderation, and a few projects and discussion rooms to get things started. But how it develops and takes shape over time will depend on your proactivity and your ideas. I can't stress this enough. There's a great deal of potential and possibilities down this path, and I look forward to seeing people take more active and formative roles here. On a similar note, the screening process doesn't just happen at the front gate or on the way in. Virtually all rooms are watched on an ongoing basis for exceptional individuals to be granted access to private rooms or offered greater responsibilities. Those especially civil or active or intelligent and insightful will likely be reached out to over time, and we appreciate you for it. And speaking of appreciation, those who have opted to support me via Patreon or Subscribestar, thank you very sincerely. It's been a tremendous help. I often feel I don't do enough to deserve it, and even with total focus, I've come to realize that I'm not the type that can put out a piece of content every week or offer perks like most on Patreon do. So the willingness to support is all the more meaningful and appreciated. I think I've recently found a way to strike an ideal balance, allowing me to create more and more often. But I also wanted to make the point that I consider my main task to be in closely observing and learning, both for my own sake and for anyone interested in the content. I think communicating anything of real value on these larger topics requires a balanced and comprehensive totality of context as its foundation, if this makes sense. And I don't want to fall into that habit of spending 90% of the time creating and 10% of the time thinking and learning, for the same reason it's not ideal to spend 90% of your life speaking and 10% listening. I think we all speak far too much, myself included, I say at the conclusion of a 1-hour video. At the same time, I think we're pushed by necessity and by our times to speak a bit more often than we might do otherwise. So I suppose it's all about striking an ideal balance. And I appreciate the patience from supporters as I seek to strike my own balance here. In closing, I often share the quote of Frederick the Great about the necessity of adapting to the times and situation in which we find ourselves, at least enough to help meaningfully manifest positive change within it. Like many of you, I'm sure, I'd often felt like I was born in the wrong era, ill-suited to this environment and modernity as we know it, and I think this makes sense. It's easy to perceive much more health and order and natural vitality in these memories of what was across time and space. Though perhaps it's for this very reason that we're additionally valuable in the here and now. So much of modernity might be fairly thought of as a disease, and one that needs to be fought. And across the span of time, from the broadest perspective, we're essentially on the front line. One might even say behind enemy lines. And if one truly sought to have maximum effect, where else would they rather be? Wars aren't fought like they used to be. A societal evolution allowing cowards, deceivers, and hollow men to obtain power and influence and enjoy their 15 minutes of fame. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that regardless of our feelings on the matter, this is our battlefield. There's no changing it and no running from it. The cultural war, the psychological and spiritual war, is raging as we speak, whether we choose to recognize it or not. And any and all physical or martial action that might someday manifest is very much downstream from this larger battle, an outgrowth or side effect. We don't need to win everyone over, and in fact, many are so far gone that eventual separation might be the only solution, allowing them to live according to their own whims and accordingly experience the crash and burn firsthand. But we should be aiming to win over our people, those still able to hear, who still have some sense of a much more ancient and healthy and lasting conception of existence. Those who haven't allowed this to be purged and replaced with the ephemeral and superficial nonsense of the pop culture and intellectualism of a dying culture. And as always, keep your head up. For what it's worth, I'd urge everyone to stop looking at the demographic and cultural trends of the past few decades, taking these as some guarantee that all is lost. This is a mistake. Such data acts as a warning, yes, but it's the furthest thing from any guarantee. These are trends within our current frame our current model. Times like these are pivot points in history, and during major pivot points, such frames and models can be cast aside, destroyed, reinvented. Trends can reverse or become irrelevant practically overnight. This virus situation is a good example here. Consider how quickly borders have been sealed, how quickly we've shifted from absurd nonsense like transgender bathrooms or a Green New Deal, how profoundly our attitudes are shifting with regard to China or globalism. Only in the most comfortable and coddled times can such extreme ignorance and degenerate thinking dominate the day. It's the softness itself that turns so many into unthinking drones. But these days are over, and we're certainly turning a corner. We need to recognize the potential here and resist that poisonous, bleak mindset. The self-fulfilling prophecy of doom and gloom and perceived powerlessness is the greatest threat. Those that act small inevitably become small. We're not that. Let's not act like it. Thanks for listening. I hope you're all well, healthy, and striving in the right direction.